Hi everyone, welcome to this tutorial on PID tuning in INAV. And today's topic will be to have a look at some black box footage, as well as analyze the data using PID Toolbox, and basically give you a rundown of what you can expect if you ever have to tune a quad from scratch. Now, before we go on to the actual PID tuning, I'd like to first of all show you the effects that you can expect when you have different kinds of PID settings. So I found this very useful image online that very nicely illustrates what the effects are of a good versus a bad PID tune. So what we have here is basically different ratios of P and I. We're only looking at P and I for now because we're not going to look at D, because P and I is actually the most important ratio that you need to get right. The D term is helping you, but it's only helping you in like prop wash situations realistically, and we can ignore D for now. So the thing to point out is obviously this image in the middle, or this graph in the middle, is what we are trying to achieve, right? This is what we want. And if we see, we've got our set point. Now this is an idealized diagram of the set point. So the set point is moving straight up, and then the PID controller is trying to follow that set point. In the case where our I is half of what it should be, or let's say it's very low in general, what we'll get is oscillations, right? And the size of these oscillations and the number of times that they overshoot or undershoot, as it is the case in this graph here, for example, depends basically on the P value, right? Now, you can have a very low I and a very low P, and you will overshoot slightly, and it will usually only undershoot once. The more you increase P, the further it will undershoot, and the further it undershoots, the more it will overshoot again and again. And if you have a ratio that is just insanely high, so if P is just 4 times greater than I, let's say, in an idealized situation, then you will have crazy oscillations, aka flyaway. What happens if we start increasing I? Well, if we increase I, but P is not sufficient, then it will take a very long time for us to actually approach the set point. Because I term takes time to build up, so to say. It's an error calculation that happens, and it takes time for this error to start building up until it reaches the set point. If, however, P is too high, then one of the things that we can see is they're very similar, right? When we have I, which is, just about right, and a P that is very high, it's similar to a P that is just about right and an I that is very low. The only difference is that the magnitude, if you look at the graph, the magnitude of these is very different. And it's very difficult to judge this, to be honest. So we'll get into that once we have a look at the actual black box data. But what happens if we have a very high P and a very high I, as is the case over here? Well, in that case, we will basically take what we have in this graph and just shift this peak all the way down, as you can see, and then we get something that's more of an undershoot, a very, very pronounced undershoot, and then it will approach the set point. So this is again something that we don't want, and we're not going to discuss these. These are very two similar situations where we're, it's essentially like having a very low P and a mediocre I. What we want is this in both pitch and roll. We won't be discussing the yaw axis at the moment, because yaw tuning is a bit more difficult than that, and it depends on a couple of other factors as well. So yeah, we won't be discussing the third axis basically in this video. But one thing that I'd like to share with you before we actually go into this is two very important things that I got wrong from the start, and it was because I was given bad advice. There is a video from Paweł Spikowski that basically says that you can copy the P and I term directly from Betaflight. And this was a quad that flies perfectly with a Betaflight tune. The BOB57 is factory tuned. There's even a tuning video of the things that you might want to change from EllisVanJason, and his PID tune is even better and even sharper than the factory tune. The factory tune is a bit softer, a bit more gentle, but both of them are doing an incredibly good job at maintaining the user input, the desired user input, and ensuring that your quad just flies razor sharp, okay? Unfortunately, I did try copying the P and I term and just having a very low D, or the stock INAV D, basically, which I think it was 20 or 23, and that didn't work out. It resulted in an immediate flyaway of the quad. Luckily, the ground was muddy, it crashed into the ground, no electronics were damaged. The GoPro didn't hit a rock or anything like that, so lens didn't crack, and everything was fine. But I would strongly suggest that you do not copy your P and I term as you have them in Betaflight, or in general, just don't follow that advice, because although they might be computed the same way or a similar way, the effects that they have on your quad are very different. The second and very, very important key takeaway point is from another video from Chris Rosser, where he explains that one of the things that you should do is to lower your rates so that you can do the basement tuning method, right? And his advice is to go for rates like 250 degrees per second. But the rates that you want to fly at are maybe 700 degrees per second. In my case, they're 670, which I believe is the default for many people, right? This is something that we as humans like. Some people fly with 1000 degrees per second, and that's really insane. But anyway, the issue is that if you do your PID tune, in INAV at least, with very low rates, then you have to imagine that PID tuning heavily depends on how your quad is constructed. If you have a light quad that has the center of mass towards the center of the quad, and you have a very light battery, for example, because you're only flying for 3 minutes per battery or something like that, then your PID tune will not depend that much on the rates, right? Because the inertia that you have in both cases, the rotational inertia when you're rolling and when you're pitching or rotating around the pitch axis, then you just won't have a difference in these two scenarios. The BOB57, unfortunately, is a larger quad. It's a 6-inch, and it's got an all-up weight of roughly 1.3 kilograms, right? So it's a heavy drone, okay? And the reason why you cannot use the PID tune is for 250 degrees per second versus 670 is because the amount of rotational inertia that the drone needs to counteract once you have moved the set point to the stick dead center position is a lot. And in order to compensate for that, the PID tune cannot be the same. It just doesn't make sense. So whilst it might be good for things like tiny whoops and things that you can realistically tune in a basement, it definitely does not work. And I strongly suggest that you do not copy the P and I terms as suggested in Paweł Spikowski's video. And we'll be going into details of why this is the case, but let's basically dive right in, okay? So I'll show you, the first thing I'll show you is a couple of the black box logs, and we'll be looking at what changes I've made versus, you know, how the whole thing turned out in the end. This was basically with more or less a stock PID tune. You can see a massive overshoot, right? We're in this scenario where we have lots of wobbles. After that, the wobbles are very unpredictable, and this is just because this was a realistic flight. In a realistic flight, you don't just continuously have oscillations and have sharp stick inputs. In a realistic flight, you want the drone to be flying nice and straight, for example, in certain occasions, and then you do a sharp turn, roll, whatever, any kind of a sharp movement. So this is not really representative. However, the fact that we have an overshoot is still true. Once you start PID tuning and you adjust a very high P, as I've shown you in the previous picture, we get these oscillations. Okay, this is basically an indicator that P is just too high, and we have oscillations all over the place. Now, you might think that the heavier the quad is, the more P you need, but it's not the P that you need. It's the PD bounce that you need to get right. And I'll show you that when I show you the final tune. Keep in mind, this is the tune that I was doing for 250 degrees per second. All of these, which are named black box log, etc., this is all with 250 degrees per second. And I'm trying to tune for that. As we go on, there are some improvements. We can see some improvements for sure, but they're, you know, I'm inching my way forward. And the way that I'm doing this is completely wrong, because I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning, to be honest. As you can see, my feed forward, for example, which for some reason in PID Toolbox is currently CD, but that's supposed to be feed forward, is wrong. You shouldn't tune a quad with feed forward. However, I will show you what the effects of feed forward are, and you might not expect them. So hold on. Let's go on a bit further. I did a total of 28 tuning flights. 28 black box logs, each of which have about 5 flights, and I'm just showing you the best scenarios, right? So this is, for example, someone might say, okay, well, you know, this is good enough. Okay, we've got a little bit of an overshoot, then a bit of an undershoot, but then it's quite stable, right? And this is with a sample size of about 100, here even about 150. So we're already getting to that sweet spot where we want to be. However, we can improve on this. But because I didn't know exactly what I was doing, I was kind of missing the point, and I was making many mistakes along the way. But then again, I was following certain YouTube videos which don't quite in detail explain everything that you need to know. And this is why this video is going to last a bit longer as well. But I want you to understand what it is that a PID tune actually does versus, you know, just copying things from one software into another. Once you understand this, once you grasp what we're looking at here, I think you will have a much easier time. In my case, if I look at this now, I should have realized that maybe my I is actually not bad. Maybe my D is not bad either. But what's definitely wrong is my P term, because I'm getting an overshoot and I'm getting this bouncing, which means that actually both my P and my D are too high. The fact that my I term overcorrects this at the top is also an indication that my I term is too high as well. But I didn't know this at the beginning, and you know, this is really the first time that I've done any PID tuning on my own. But I think I really got there, and you'll see that in the end. So if we continue, we can see that the results are very similar. I keep changing one or two values, but I'm not really getting there. However, what I did here is I did add some feed forward. You can see that here in a 20. I've added feed forward for both the pitch and roll axis. And in order to add feed forward, I had to decrease P, because the way that feed forward actually works is it directly translates your stick input into a moving set point, right? So one of the issues that you will have with that is your P is now multiplied in a way by the feed forward. So when you increase, at least in INAV, this is the case, when you increase the feed forward, the effect that this causes is an increased, an effectively increased P term. So it's not, you know, when you start increasing feed forward, you need to start also decreasing P term, right? Because the only thing that feed forward will actually help you with is to reduce the latency. And if we have a look at the latency here, we can see that the latency did reduce after adding a bit of feed forward, okay? So you can see that all of these are very, very similar. And I'm really trying hard to get to that sweet spot. But the problem is, again, my I term is too high, which is why I'm getting this strange bouncing and weird behavior, right? This is the problem with I term. It's very difficult to tune a quad when you have such high I terms to begin with. This is why I suggest that when you do start tuning your quad, you completely remove I term. You just set it to 0 and you start with P and D. Probably figures between 10 on both, 10 and 20 should give you a good starting point, and then you should start varying both simultaneously whilst keeping one. You keep one constant and you start increasing D, maybe in increments of 10, plus 10, minus 10, then you go with P, you select the D that's best for this, and then you go with P, plus 10, minus 10, and then you slowly inch your way forward to the right PD balance. And I didn't know at the time that this is what's supposed to be what I'm supposed to be doing. But here's the final tune, and this is very close to what I considered at the time I can be happy with, right? However, what I did after that is I went out in the field and I increased my rates, because obviously I'm not going to be flying with 250 degrees per second rates. That makes no sense. And you'll see that the effects of that are that. This is flying with almost the same. You can see the first flight and the second flight are almost the same thing, but look at the graph. It looks nothing like what I did in the basement, right? Because I've increased my rates. It's no longer the same. This no longer applies. And it took me a while to figure out that this is basically an issue, and I don't know if this is an issue with Betaflight as well. I can tell you for sure, based on this data, that it's an issue with INAV, because if you do increase your rates, your PIDs are no longer valid, right? And we can keep going. I did make some changes in the field, and I did try to iron this out, but essentially, I just didn't really get anywhere. I tried lowering P, I tried increasing P, I tried decreasing I tried many things, but it was getting dark, and I just didn't see the point in flying when it's dark, because I can't see, obviously. So anyway, we're not going to go through all of these in too much detail. Obviously, you can see that I've tried many things to slowly get there, but none of this stuff actually works. Okay, none of this stuff was really good, and the reason why was because I didn't know what I was doing. And well, the first issue that you can see is I have a high I, right? Like my I is already at 30, and I'm not realizing that I can cause issues, and P can also cause issues, and I'm not realizing that actually my P needs to be half of what it is right here. One of the things is I only saw this graph after all of these flights. It would have been very useful if I could see it before, because then I could match up my data. However, one of the things that you will notice is that I am improving the pitch axis, right? So the pitch axis, interestingly enough, has a sweet ratio of 40, 30, 50, and that is without feed forward. So once I add feed forward, and this is basically the next thing I'll be doing, once I add feed forward, in order to reduce the latency, I will be decreasing P, because essentially that's going to be the effect. However, the graph, as far as I'm concerned, looks perfect. And I think anyone looking at this will probably say, okay, this is where I can stop for the pitch axis. And this is exactly what I've done. So let's have a look at this here. Let's have a look at flight number 4 and 5 together. Now you can see one of the things that I was varying here is I decreased my I to a much lower value, and then I started playing around with D, slowly lowering D to what I believed was a better value. And in some cases I kept I constant, in other cases I kept D constant and started decreasing P because I wanted to see the effects, but having them in one graph like this doesn't quite demonstrate it. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly run them one by one so you can see the effects and what the effect is of decreasing P, right? So you can see my P is quite good at the moment. P is 28, the PD balance is quite good in terms of not overshooting. It's actually quite close to not overshooting. But the problem is that we are currently in this scenario here, right? So we're just about to overshoot, but then we undershoot and then it starts wobbling around the set point, which is not what we want, really, okay? So keep in mind that now I is still very low, but now D is causing a similar effect in terms of this wobbliness as I did in these examples, right? In these textbook style examples. So let's continue. You'll see that the graph starts to look very weird. Essentially, the set point isn't really reached. The peak is still here, but the set point isn't really reached. And so obviously D is just too high. It's the dampening that D is causing. Eventually what will happen is this line or this peak will completely disappear, and this line will continue straight down like that. And then it will look very similar to something like this, okay? It will look very similar to this. Although this is I, it will look very similar to this graph. But you can see that these three graphs all look very similar to each other. It's very difficult to actually identify what the cause will be. However, if you have a PD balance that is like 2 to 1, or 1 to 2 in this case, then you should probably rethink whether your D is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. Anyway, let's continue. Let's have a look at these flights. So in the 5th iteration, I was doing a bit more changes to the D. I started decreasing it to see the effects of that. Obviously, because I started decreasing D, my P started overshooting, because actually I should have realized at this point that my P is too high. I should be decreasing both D and P, except that I should have decreased D by twice as much as I'm decreasing P, because they were already to begin with the wrong ratio. If we have a look at these flights, again, I'm continuing to decrease D and P both together, and I'm slowly getting there, right? So we can see that basically this you might consider as okay, right? This might not be that bad. You might be perfectly fine with flying like this, except you need to add I, and I will help you to iron out this here, right? This undershoot, because it will accumulate the error, and if it's too high, it will cause the error to be greater. If it's too low, it will cause the error to exist in the first place. So a good I would have helped me here, but because I set I to 0, we don't quite know what happened. So let's continue, because there's quite a bit more to go. So we can see I'm slowly getting there. Again, it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but I am kind of getting there. In particular, this flight provided a relatively okay example, but the problem is that if you look at this, it's starting to drift away from the set point. And this is definitely eye related. So if you see something like this, don't be afraid. Don't focus on basically this part of the graph. Only focus on this part on the graph. Forget about what's happening here, because this will improve as soon as we start adding eye. Only focus on this. And if you look at this, you can still see that there is an overshoot and there is an undershoot. And in order to remove this, all you need to do is decrease your P. And then you can start adding I. And we'll see that in the 8th flight, I believe it was. Let's have a look. I did a test flight where I started increasing I. Well, anyway, ignore this. I was just reducing D again, hoping that it would improve, but actually what D did is it just shifted this whole thing up. So if we look at the 7th flight series and the 8th, the only difference is that in one case we had undershoots, in the other case we just had an overshoot and a bounce back. Let's look at number 9. Again, I'm still hunting for it, but what I am also doing is I am starting to increase I. And if you see, the further I increase I, the more flat this curve becomes and gets closer to the set point, right? So this is the effect of I. This is exactly what we're supposed to be seeing. And I thought that if I start increasing I might actually iron this out. But as you can see, it did have some effect. It wasn't a very big effect, but it did have some effect. The problem is that the effect isn't good enough because the issue isn't caused by I. The issue is caused by P and D. So I still need to decrease P. And I'm going to skip the 10th flight. I'm just going to skip over to the 12th. Because in this one, I think we're getting closer. So I have now decreased my P and decreased my D. But because I've also decreased my D, I still get an overshoot. The good news is that it's more flat, okay? You can see it's no longer the way it was before where it used to bounce a lot more. It's now relatively good. And I think that I've reached a good I because you can see that it's relatively flat after that. So once it reaches the point where it wants to be, it stays there. So it doesn't drift anymore, doesn't wobble. Essentially what we saw previously, that was just drift. That was basically a drift on a particular axis. Let's have a look at 13 and 15 together, if we can do that. Might give me an error. Oh, okay, great. So that's less than 10 flights. So here we can see that we're getting there, right? So this particular flight, which had 22, 38, 28, isn't actually that bad, okay? So I've reduced my I, it's still good, it's still performing nicely, it's not drifting in any direction, so my I term is quite low, which is good. I don't need very high I term on the roll axis because my rotational inertia in the roll axis is much lower. You can think of I as helping you with that inertia because once you start spinning and the quad stops spinning, it's like a flywheel. You're trying to stop the flywheel, but imagine you have a flywheel in front of you and it's spinning at a certain RPM and you put your hands around it, you try and stop it. What will it do? It will twist your hands, right? Like you're holding on to the flywheel, but it will twist your hands in one direction. And this is almost like a flyaway, right? You can imagine this as a flyaway. And this is why we need I to be relatively high on the pitch axis, because this is where the GoPro is located on, right? Once we start rotating the quad, we've got a GoPro that sits out at front. We've got a battery that's in the middle, but up from the center of mass. And so when the quad eventually does start spinning, it has a much higher inertia, rotational inertia. So we do need both P and I to be correcting for that. You might also consider a greater I in the pitch axis, but because the pitch axis was already good enough, I didn't want to touch it, and I might try a different I in the field, because obviously field performance versus basement tuning performance will differ. But this is something that can be done in the field, and you know, varying one parameter in the field versus varying 4 parameters in the field is a bit easier, right? So we're slowly getting to our last flight, which is flight number 17, which is where we'll see the most improvements. But we are getting there. And the most important thing is that not only am I here decreasing D, but I'm also decreasing P. Okay? I finally realized that my issue is due to a very big P. And if we have a look at the last flight only, we can see that this is almost as perfect as you can get. Please ignore the pitch axis, because if we just quickly close out of that and have a look at 16.9, you can see that I'm not really doing anything in pitch. So all that this is showing you right now is kind of like an error, really. I've only done a couple of pitch movements, but most of the stuff is in the roll. You can clearly see that there is a lot of data in the roll. You can also see examples of when I kind of touch the ground, because the gyro is like all over the place and it's trying to overcorrect, and you know, weird stuff happens. But anyway, if we go back to the step response tool and scroll down to one of the last flights, we can see that we've reached a very good PI and D balance. But I'm not too happy with this, because I do still have this slight bounce back. So what I do next is I try to decrease I. By decreasing I, however, I do have a little bit more of an overshoot. And so I kind of go back and forth between these numbers, trying to find the perfect ratio. And actually, I thought that by decreasing I will get a better performance, but the reality is that that wasn't the case. And you can see here that I do have a little bit of wobble. I also have a little bit of drift. So this I-induced drift, which wasn't there in the first example, this was a much more flat curve. And it's a very tiny drift, okay? This will be, in flight, this will be barely perceptible. So you could, in theory, ignore this, okay? But the thing is that these pit tunes are essentially what I ended up going with in the end. And so actually what I did was, the pit tune that I liked the most was the 20-40-30. This is something that I haven't recorded, unfortunately. But this is what I did fly, and it ended up being a very interesting ratio. So 20-40-30 and then 40-30-50. Again, this is without feed forward. So feed forward and I are something that I'm going to tune in the field. But yeah, anyway, summary of this is basically try without I, try without feed forward. Try and get your PD balance correct first. If you get overshoots, reduce your P. If you see drift, don't worry about it. Drift is easily correctable with a bigger I term. So essentially, try and get first a good PD balance, and then start increasing your I to see at which point you'll be happy. However, one of the most important key takeaways is, if you are doing the basement tuning method, which might be difficult for some to do at 670 degrees per second, try and do it out in the field. Do it with the rates that you want to fly the quad with. Because if I try this pit tune, this particular pit tune, with rates that are far lower, it's very unlikely to work. And I'll give you a brief example. You can find, by the way, you'll be able to find this in my Google Drive link below in the video description. So if you have a look at this, the way I've organized this is because there is a bit of a problem with the firmware. That's hopefully going to get resolved. I mean, it is actually already resolved. A very nice guy on Discord, also a programmer, managed to find a bug in the firmware for the iFlight Blitz F722 flight controller. He fixed it. It's nothing major. It's literally just the LEDs that had some timer issue, so they wouldn't turn on. They were working fine in Betaflight, but not in INAV. So this is the firmware that I used. The diffs and dumps that you can find here, I'll be posting two. So there are actually going to be two folders. One folder is going to be for the 250 rates, and the other one is going to be for the 670. So I suggest that you choose that one. The black box logs are all over here, and what you'll be able to find is all of the black box logs that I recorded for the first PID tuning session, let's call it, where I was using 250 degrees rates. If you want to fly with low rates like that, then please feel free to copy the tune, but otherwise I don't suggest it. And the last thing is you'll find a summary right here where we have the PID tuning summary Excel table that will show you basically this, and you can find basically the best flights that I've chosen, as well as the, but again, this is only for 250 degrees per second. There we go. So just remember that this is only for 250 degrees per second. This is not for anything greater than that. And yeah, so there's another video that will be linked in the video description below. It's also a very long video. I think it's around 45 minutes. So you can go ahead and watch that, where I discuss how I got to the PID settings that I have for 250 degrees per second, but that video is unlisted, so you can only access it via the link in the description. If you want to watch it, go ahead and watch it. I don't recommend you to waste your time. It was a video that I then realized is just pointless. The link to this Google Drive folder will be available to you in the description below. You can find the firmware, the diffs and dumps, and you can use them as such. Keep in mind, the only thing that I haven't done is feed forward. So this will be updated. As you can see, this was only done yesterday, so this will be updated probably over the weekend, the coming weekend. And once that's done, you can just copy the diff and dump straight, and you should have a very nice flying quad. I hope you have a great flight, and I hope you enjoy INAV as much as I do. Unfortunately, Betaflight is lacking a few features, let's put it that way, such as a safe and reliable return to home, where the quad doesn't just drop out of the sky. It's actually not really a return to home, it's more of a just return in the vicinity and hope that you don't fall on someone. Anyway, Betaflight is great for other things, but just not for this. So I hope you have a great flying experience with the BOB57. It's become one of my favorite drones because it is really the best of both worlds of 5 and 7 inch quads. And I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. If you have any questions, please post them either on the Facebook forums where this video will be posted, or in the YouTube comments below. I always read my comments, so I will be answering to the best of my abilities. And yeah, if you have a quad that you believe is just very difficult to tune, feel free to drop a Google Drive link in the description below with your black box logs. I can have a look and maybe share my opinion with you. But yeah, other than that, happy flying!